Hi, everyone. I am Konrad Stump with the Springfield-Greene County Library in Springfield, Missouri. Thank you for joining us this evening for our author interview with Andy Davidson. Andy Davidson is the author of most recently, The Boatman's Daughter, which we're here to discuss tonight, and In the Valley of the Sun, which was nominated for a Bram Stoker Award and was a 2020 selection for the Horror Writers Association Summer Reading Initiative, Summer Scares. So please join me in welcoming Andy Davidson. How's it going?
Pretty good. Nice to be
Nice.
here.
Oh, yes. Yeah. So I'm going to go out on a limb and I'm going to assume that you've always been a horror fan. So would I be right in that assumption?
You would be. The first horror novel that I read, I believe, was Dean Koontz's Watchers. So I like to kind of point out that I didn't come to the genre through Stephen King, although Stephen King is probably what cemented the genre for me.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, that goes kind of to my next question, which is kind of like once you realized that you were into horror, how did you sort of foster that love of the genre? And, what kind of access did you have to spooky materials as a kid? And, was it approved of in your house or, how was that for you?
My parents were both readers, big readers. My dad, before he became a high school principal, was an English teacher, high school English, and my mother taught as well. And so reading and books was always a big deal in our house, and nothing in terms of books was ever really out of bounds. So, I mean, I probably didn't get an interest in horror until I was about 10 or 11 years old. But from that moment forward, anything I wanted to read, they never stopped me. And Dad was a big Stephen King reader, so we had all of his books as they came out practically. But I do remember when I was, I guess it was when I was, it came out in 1985, 86, something like that, 86 maybe. So I would have been pretty young at the time, but I remember he read the opening of that book out loud to me when we were in the car on a family vacation. And so in terms of who introduced me to horror, I guess you would have to say my dad. And yeah, there was never any kind of thing about that sort of material in our house being taboo or anything like that. Maybe not so much with movies being a visual medium, but I've always kind of enjoyed the fact about books that they're all in your head. So, I think this is one of the reasons things like 50 Shades of Grey are so successful, right? It's not the best literature in the world, but people can quietly sit anywhere and have these fantasies. So
Yes, it touches the imagination.
right.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I first the copy of it that he had I to kind of tie into libraries came from the high school library. And so in terms of a kind of progressive reading atmosphere, I think a copy of it being in the high school library in small town Arkansas is pretty hard to beat that.
Yeah. Well, and I've read a few Stephen King books, and definitely it is my favorite. It's one that I would like to go back and reread, even though it took me, 4 months to get through it the first time. Like it's just so well done, and like the opening is so good, and I love it. So I want to talk a bit about Summer Scares, because as I mentioned, your previous title was a Summer Scares selection for 2020. And so I'm curious to know, how stoked you were to be asked to be a part of it, and then sort of what that experience was like for you last year, being a selected author.
It was very cool. I was very excited about it. Becky Spratford sent me a kind of message on the down low before it was announced saying that it had been picked. And I was really excited because the book had been released in hardback in 2017 and it had come out again in paperback in 2019. And the sales were okay from 2017 to 2019. But I think when the book hit paperback, it really kind of took off through the Bookstagram community and people like Sadie Hartman getting a hold of it. And so in a way, the Summer Scares thing in 2020 just kind of continued this wonderful new second and third life that the book had. And so I think in some ways, it was able to keep that first novel in the consciousness of readers in a way that I think a lot of writers aren't lucky
Mhm.
to have that 3 years later, still having their first book read and talked about. So yeah, that was
Yeah.
pretty cool.
Yeah, yeah. And so one of the right points of summer scares, I think, is to get horror in the hands of more readers to kind of foster this love of
Mhm.
reading. And you touched on it a bit, but I'd like to hear more about just sort of the importance of libraries in your life growing up, and just sort of what role they played.
Sure. We had a great library in the small town in Arkansas where I grew up. The town was Camden, Arkansas, and it was one of those libraries that was pretty small. So the fiction section for adults was probably about 8 rows, and the juvenile section was 3 or 4 maybe. But that was a whole corner of the library, and of course they had things, wonderful things like I think they had the entire Hardy Boys collection, and that was where I first started reading books in the library was through the Hardy Boys. Um, but yeah, it was a great library. They had a couple of shelves up front with all of the new releases, and I would always go right to that shelf when I would walk in. And I remember getting a library card. What a great feeling that was, just to have that. It felt like you had arrived kind of as a responsible person to have a card that would allow you to take books away and bring them back. Although I was not always the best about returning things on time. Uh, I I had a habit of tallying up the late fees and putting the change into an envelope, sticking it in the book, and just putting the books into the outside bin so that I could kind of flee and run away. Um, but I loved that library. Unfortunately, when I was in graduate school, it burned down. Um, and they eventually rebuilt the library, but they put it on a different side of town. And I haven't been in it, but it's a very different kind of building. It's a corrugated kind of metal building. It has a really sort of unappealing aesthetic to it. And the original library that I grew up going to was an old brick building with big wide brick steps, and it was just a wonderful place and space to be a kid reading books.
Yeah, that's great. I love the story about putting the change in an envelope in the book. And
Yeah.
I get that. Yeah, you have guilt over it, but if it makes you feel any better, I'm still pretty terrible about turning my books in on time, and I go to the library on a daily basis. So
I was going to say, though, you're a librarian. That's like, it seems like you would have a bit of
like
latitude with
a
that.
golden ticket to just turn in
Right.
books whenever. Maybe I
Yeah.
do. So then on sort of the right now, like I'm curious to know what the role of libraries are in your life now, especially as an author, right?
Mhm.
Sort of and how do you interact with them, that kind of thing.
A lot like this.
Hmm.
I've talked to a lot of librarians through the connections I have with people at the HWA, the Horror Writers Association. Librarians have been largely responsible for getting my books out into the world in a way that I think even social media can't do, because you have a real person with a book in his or her hand putting it in someone else's hand, and that's a huge deal. Um, I think about folks like, I mentioned when we were talking before about Becky Spratford and Summer Scares, but also Corey Fahrenkopf up in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
He's been a huge, hey, read this book. And he had me to the library up there in Barnstable for an event. And so it was right before COVID kind of took hold. It was one of the last events that I did in February for the promotion of the Boatman's Daughter. My wife and I were able to go there, and of course they have a wonderful library that's very old world feeling, and they have there in the back of the library a copy of like a first edition of Moby Dick, and
Wow.
so you get to lay eyes on that. And so the experience of being a writer is nothing but enriched, I think, by the relationships you build with librarians, because one of the things I like to say about being a writer is that statistically, once you hit 40 or whatever, you're not supposed to make friends. You're not supposed to meet new people, right? But I've been fortunate that since 2017, every year I just keep making new acquaintances and new friendships with people. And that's something that prior to 2017, I was not doing. So libraries have been a big part of that, in fact. But yeah, I think that libraries have played a really important part for me in my being able to be read, basically.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I met Corey during StokerCon. He was on a panel I moderated about programming in libraries, and he was so great, and what he does is so great. And he convinced me to join Twitter finally, so it was all his doing.
Right. Well, I'm
But
very honored to be one of the first couple of tweets that you've actually made this
oh
promoting this
well,
event.
yes.
So
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I was gonna say too, just like I was curious about, the past year and with COVID and doing these virtual events, like how that has been for you and whether you're starting to do in-person things again or kind of what your plans are for that.
I have not done anything in person since March of
Mhm.
2020. The very last event that I did was in Arkansas, in Russellville, at Dog Ear Books. I have a friend who lives there in town who had kind of gotten me that gig, I think, because he knows the bookstore owners. And so it was very nice and fitting that the last event for the Boatman's Daughter would be in Arkansas. But it hit at a moment when people were already kind of being told, let's stop traveling. And
Yeah.
so there had been a little bit of a question in my mind, do I do this or not? And in the end, I decided, well, I'm going to drive 10 hours straight there from Georgia. I'm going to do the event. I'm not going to, touch anybody, stay my distance, and drive back home. And that was the absolute last thing I did for that book. And ever since, everything has been virtual, kind of like this, but not so much just one-on-one type events. I've done book clubs. I've met some wonderful people through Michigan, librarians up in Michigan, and so even got a couple of T-shirts out of the deal in the mail. So there's been a lot of this, and I think this has had its own kind of weird set of opportunities that wouldn't have happened if I had just been doing live events. Like early on, I think it was in April of 2020, I was able to be a part of a reading event with people like Christopher Buehlman, Paul Tremblay, Josh Mallerman, some of these people that you kind of would just dream to be put at a table in a room somewhere with them. So it's had its good aspects, I guess, and it certainly helps you to reach people in ways you can't, because I can't afford the gas, to drive everywhere, or
That's
the
fair.
plane tickets.
Yeah.
So I hope this continues in some aspect in the future, for future books. I do.
Yeah, and I bet it will. I mean, it's interesting just sort of the effect it's had, especially with I think libraries and it's normalized virtual programming. So like patrons are more used to this kind of a setup, and it does provide a lot of opportunities where you can just bring people from anywhere into this sort of virtual environment and do these events that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do because you can't easily bring all those people together. So I think that there will continue to be virtual events, and there could be some like hybrid sort of events where people are in person, but maybe they're seeing someone virtually. And so I think that's sort of where we're headed, to this interesting hybrid virtual in-person world. So
Yeah.
I'm down for the ride.
I think the publishers are in for that too. I've noticed people, even my publisher also publishes, I guess I really should say they also publish me. They publish Jeff Vandermeer
Oh yeah.
and me, and a lot of other people, but they publish Jeff Vandermeer. And I've noticed that his most recent book that came out is, I think it was an entirely virtual tour. So there's
Okay,
this idea
yeah.
of virtual book tours now that are,
Hmm.
it is taking hold.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. So yes, let's talk about the Boatman's Daughter. So I recently rewatched your Summer Scares video that you made, which was fantastic with the fence in the yard. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But in it, you mentioned how within the Valley of the Sun, it didn't originally have a supernatural element, and then you kind of went back and reworked it to have that. So I'm curious, when you started working on the Boatman's Daughter, whether you had an idea for the supernatural elements in mind, or if you kind of went with the real world stuff first, or how that worked.
Um, Definitely had the idea in mind. I think my approach to horror is a combination of having a supernatural aspect to it and infusing that with reality in every way that I possibly can. Character, uh, plot, um, the setting, the environment that something takes place in, making it seem grounded in a real world is very important to me. Um, because I just think that makes it more accessible for maybe even people who don't read horror. But I I started out the Boatman's Daughter with a couple of kind of touchstones of inspiration for what I wanted to do with the supernatural. And the idea was I wanted to set something in my home state, kind of in the kind of backyard that I grew up in, which was not far from a place called Falk, Arkansas. And Falk is kind of famous for this 1970, 60 something film called The Legend of Boggy Creek, which is about a kind of Sasquatch like creature that lives in the woods around Falk in the river bottoms. And it's a pseudo documentary. It's kind of a hokey film by today's standards, but it's also an amazing like horror film in the sense that in 1969, maybe when it was made, like pseudo documentaries didn't really exist. There wasn't that genre like we have now. And so it was far ahead of its time and really good too, like really well made. And so I liked the idea of creatures in the woods, basically, like a kind of myth about a place that that was an inspiration, and because that was so close to home. And the other thing that I really wanted to write about was witches. I had this idea in my head that with In the Valley of the Sun, I had written about vampires. And so I thought, well, maybe what I could do as a writer approaching a next book, because the second book is always the most frightening book, maybe more so than the first one, because the first one, you're kind of surprised you're able to do it when you get it done. And then the second book is the one that you've got to prove to yourself you can do it again, right? So by the time you get to the third book, you're kind of thinking like, okay, I can do this because I keep doing it. But in the case of the second book, I was thinking, well, maybe my thing as a writer in the horror genre could be, I'll take a monster, I'll take a traditional notion in horror, and I'll do something with it that roots it in the real world. So vampires in the West and Texas, and then witches. I was just thinking about witches. I'm not sure what it was in particular, but I know that the idea of a swamp lends itself to the notion of the witch who kind of lives in the woods apart, separate from society. And the Baba Yaga was a thing that I was very much into for a couple of different reasons. One of them being Hellboy. There's a
Hmm.
wonderful Baba Yaga story in the Hellboy comic. So I really liked that character and that mythology. And I thought, well, how do I take that and put that together with the idea of a creature that lives in the woods in these river bottoms? And eventually that morphed into the little fish character in The Boatman's Daughter, which grew out of Caliban in Shakespeare's Tempest, which was kind of a structure for me when I wrote the book, that play and those characters. So it's a complicated answer to what is essentially a simple question. but yeah, that's kind of it.
Yeah. So you mentioned using the Shakespeare as a sort of template in the writing process with the characters. And so I'm curious, sort of like what your writing process looked like for the book, like outlines or character list, and how did you go about sort of building on that skeleton of the idea to get to the book?
Um, One of the things that I do when I start any project is I have a notebook and I fill up generally one notebook with ideas and doodles and sort of just scenes that I think I might want to see if I have some characters in my mind. The Tempest helped me with characters for this book because you have the Caliban character, you have the Prospero character, the father character, you have the Miranda,
Mhm.
the character in the play. And so I approached character by reading the play and thinking about all the things about the characters that I would rather see or would want to invert or subvert. In the case of Miranda, for example, she's a very kind of passive creature in the Tempest. She's kind of operates at the whims and machinations of her father. And I thought, well, I don't want a passive heroine. Nobody wants to read that. I want a heroine who makes her own fate, makes her own luck. And so that was the impetus for her. And I think in the case of Caliban, Caliban is a very pitiable figure, but he's also quite monstrous in the Shakespearean play. And so I thought, well, I want him to be not monstrous. I want him to be grotesque. I want him to be a character that would be frightening to people if they ran across him in the woods, but he is a child. He is a simple creature who is a creature of light. And so I made a lot of notes of that kind of in that way, and then probably made some drawings of things, but ultimately it all kind of ends up before the writing starts for me with maps.
Mm.
I always go to maps and I look at a region that I'm thinking I want to set this in, and I kind of figure out the geography of that region. And in this case, it was a very small section of a county in southwestern Arkansas. And in figuring out the structure for the book, it was very simple. I knew I wanted a compressed time frame, just a few days that the narrative takes place over the course of, really, the proper narrative anyway. And it was a simple matter of figuring out, okay, here's a river, here's a length of river. This is how much time it would take this character to get from point A to point B in a boat. What can happen between those points? How many times would she have to go back and forth between point A and point B? And that became pretty much the structure of the book, these three runs that she has to make and all the trouble that ensues in the course of getting back and forth and doing her job basically as a drug runner.
Yeah. Well, that kind of brings me to my next question, because you mentioned that you grew up in Arkansas. And so I'm curious to know sort of how much, things you remembered from your childhood or sort of the area influenced the writing, and how much you had to sort of how they influenced the landscape, the characters, and what research you kind of had to do in order to set it there.
As far as my childhood, it was mainly that film
Hmm.
and the place, the location of Falk. I had been to Falk before, and Falk, if you go on the right kind of day when the rain is kind of falling or it's a gray day and there's a little mist in the air, it's a creepy place, especially if you get deeper and deeper into those woods.
Hmm.
So really that, in terms of setting from my childhood, in terms of research, I read a very big book, which, well, I have it down here. You can't really see it, but it's called The Bathhouse at Midnight. So when I knew I wanted to use the Baba Yaga, I thought, well, I've got to read as much as I can about Slavic folklore and magic. Otherwise, I'm going to look like an idiot if I try to write this about a culture that I don't really know that well. And in the course of doing that, my research led me to learn a little bit more about Arkansas, which is that in Prairie County, Arkansas, which I was not familiar with this story. In Arkansas, there was actually a colony, a Slavic colony of people who established a community there in a certain part of the delta of Arkansas. So I kind of worked that into the witch's backstory and character. I grew up in the Baptist church, so a lot of the Billy Cotton character is kind of drawn from the more extreme ends of some of the things that I heard growing up as a kid in the church. So yeah, I guess it's kind of a combination of those two things: what I knew as a kid and where I'm from and my roots, and yeah, just research, reading big books.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I did want to say, so we're not too far from Boggy Creek. That's pretty. It's like
That's
all the
right.
way
Yeah,
south. It's yeah, it's like all the way south in Arkansas. I looked today to see if it like constituted as being in the Ozarks, but I don't think it does. I think it's too far south.
No.
But we had Lyle Blackburn, who's a cryptozoologist, came to the library, and it was like a super popular program. So people are really into Bigfoot, and we almost showed the movie, but I think for some reason we didn't end up showing the movie. So I've still not seen it, but it's been on my radar. Yeah. And so another thing I wanted to ask is that, right, the Boatman's Daughter is a Southern Gothic. So I'm curious to know what some of your favorite Southern Gothics are, and whether there were any that you had in mind or influenced you when you were working on this.
I am yes, the answer is yes. I'm a huge fan of Davis Grubb's The Night of the Hunter. And I don't know if, I mean, technically, I guess you could call that a Southern Gothic. It's set in, I want to say, West Virginia. So maybe that's a Southern Gothic, but it's definitely Gothic. And the film, of course, that Charles Laughton adapted in the 50s is very Gothic too, and draws on German expressionism and those sorts of things. So both of those were huge influences. Davis Grubb's one of those forgotten writers that his language and his lyricism is beautiful. He's an amazing writer when he's good. Some of his other books, maybe he's not always great, but he's always entertaining to read. I'm a huge Flannery O'Connor fan. We're right here in Cochrane, which is about maybe an hour from Milledgeville, where she lived. And so my wife and I have been to her house a couple of times and walked in the woods there, and it's wonderful. But yeah, I love Flannery O'Connor's work. Good Man Is Hard to Find, Revelation. Those stories are wonderful. And she's so great because she's so mean. That's one of the things I love about Flannery O'Connor is she's just mean and very Southern at the same time that she's intensely Roman Catholic. And when I was at the University of Mississippi, one of my mentors was Barry Hanna, and Barry was a wonderful kind of, at times, Gothic writer, although not everything certainly that he wrote fits into that category. But yeah, I mean, I like Shirley Jackson a great deal. Her work, in terms of direct influences on the Boatman's Daughter, though, probably just the Davis Grubb was something that I went back to and reread. Cormac McCarthy's not Southern exactly. He kind of is. If you look at books like Child of God, which is set in, I think, Tennessee, around the Smoky Mountains, or in that area, Sevier County, I think. So he's definitely one that I read as well. So yeah, anything that has some grit and blood to it that is in this book, probably Cormac McCarthy had something to do with it. So yeah.
Have you ever read Blackwater by Michael McDowell?
I haven't, and ever
Okay.
since I've
Yeah.
been doing events, that book has come up many times, and
Yeah.
I'm actually kind of glad I didn't read it,
Yeah.
because
Uh,
apparently the comparisons are, people have made the comparisons, and I'm just like, woof,
there are
glad I
tons
haven't
of
read
like
that.
different things, but I mean it's something that someone who enjoyed the Boatman's Daughter would also enjoy. And
Mhm,
yeah, it's really good. It's like it's, you know, six different books, and then it's very kind of slow to get to where it's going, but
mhm,
it's worth it. And it's more about the people, which is, you know, we kind of talked about with the realistic aspect is kind of the more interesting thing, right? You're
mhm.
invested in the characters. And so yeah, I think it's a good read alike for the Boatman's
Okay.
Daughter. I wish I thought about that when I was working on the programming guide last year, but I didn't. So speaking of horror, um, I want to ask just a general book question and ask sort of, you know, what is um, a horror book or speculative fiction, let's say, that you've read recently that you really enjoyed that you think people should check out, or who's an author that you think people should know better than they do?
At one time, I would have said Stephen Graham Jones is someone people should know better than they do. But at this particular moment, that
Hmm.
answer is a little outdated, because The
Yep.
Only Good Indians has been such a success. Um, but I would still say him. I would say Stephen is someone that if you haven't read anything but that book, there's a lot of
Hmm.
other work that he's done as well. That's certainly one of the greatest things I could recommend right now is him. Um, I'm a big Joe Lansdale fan. I
Okay. Yeah.
anything by Joe Lansdale. And he's a writer that writes in all different genres across the board. He's not just a horror writer. Um, but I really like his work. He's written some Southern Gothics. He's got one coming out pretty soon, I think, Moon Lake.
Hmm.
Um, goodness, Victor Laval is great. If you
Hmm.
haven't read The Changeling, that's a good book. Paul Tremblay is great. I mentioned him earlier. But yeah, in terms of other writers, I think about people like, I'm looking at my to read shelf over here, and there's Jeremy Robert Johnson. Uh, Gwendolyn Keist is a writer that I
Hmm.
really enjoy reading. She's great. Um, yeah, lots of stuff. Most of the stuff I'm looking at here on the shelf is it's these people are either dead or already famous, you know. So so
That's fair.
yeah.
Yeah, I read Kai's The Rest Maidens, and I really enjoyed that a lot. So I wanted to
Mhm.
check out more of her stuff. But yeah, I tend to also sort of be into like um, a lot of older stuff. I mean, especially horror. I like to read stuff from the 70s and 80s. And,
Mhm.
you know, I really like Victorian classics a lot.
Mhm.
So, which made me want to ask you about classics because of The Tempest. And if you, um, are a fan of classics and you know and if there's something that you think people should revisit that they might have written off.
Well, I'm kind of weird about that. I've come to things at different times in my life. So the notion of the classics for me is like, well, a classic to me could be anything from 1930 back,
Mhm.
you know, to the I so I'm like if I were to look at my shelf, you would probably find, certainly in terms of horror, you'd find Stoker, you'd find Mary Shelley, you'd find all those wonderful things. In terms of just the general books that I like that we would consider classics, I recently, in the last few years, for the first time, came to Moby Dick. I had never read it. And I guess it's one of those books that, for me at least, you have to be the right age and at the right set of life circumstances to read it and truly appreciate it. And I thought it was amazing, which goes without saying, I guess. It's kind of a dumb thing. You heard it here first. Moby Dick's a great book. Um, but no, I try to read poetry some, but
Mhm.
most of the poetry I read is pretty modern. People like Charles Bukowski,
Mhm.
you know, So yes, I mean, I'm a huge advocate for reading outside your genre as a writer,
Hmm.
and as a reader, reading as much as you possibly can that is um, not just junk food. You know,
Yes.
junk
Yeah.
food's
Yeah.
fine, but the more you can read that develops your sense of discernment, I guess, as a reader, the better. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah. I see you have Moby Dick underneath the swamp thing back there.
right.
But yeah, that's one of those.
That says it all. Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of those books that I've always kind of thought like, maybe I'll never read that. But I also don't like to say I'll never read something because,
Right.
and I agree. I think you have to be sort of at the right age to appreciate things. So I've wanted to go back and read The Great Gatsby because I read it in high school and, didn't think much of it. But
Hmm.
so I like to try to actively revisit some of those books
Well,
occasionally. But yeah, the idea of the classic is sort of like, what does that mean and who's deciding that?
sure. And like I think about like a book like Lord of the Flies, which when you read that book at 13 or whatever, that's going to mean something completely different to you than when you read it when you're 33 or whatever. Um, but yeah, so I don't believe in a kind of prescriptive canon that we have to read these certain writers because they are necessary to our education as people. But I do believe as readers, we should try to read certain writers. I think about people, good example that my wife and I always talk about. She teaches early American literature at the university level, and she assigns the Scarlet Letter to her American lit classes because essentially that book is not really taught anymore in high schools. And I read it in high school. It
Yeah.
was something we had to read. We read The House of the Seven Gables as
Mhm.
well. So um, that's a book that I would kind of point to and say, give it a shot because it's going to mean something very different to you at a certain age than it would when you're 17 and you don't want to read anything.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a book I remember reading in high school and enjoying, but one that I
Oh, good.
also want to reread as an adult because, you just get so much more out of it. Jane Eyre is probably my favorite book. I know that's
Hmm.
typical.
Mhm.
But like I read it every few years and I feel like every reading you kind of get something different out of it. So that's why
Right.
I like revisiting those books. You just kind of get more out of them. So I want
Well,
to ask
that's
a
a great
couple. Yeah.
working definition of the classics is the books that keep on giving. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. So I want to ask a couple of final questions. The first one is, of course, what are you working on now? Do you have anything coming up in general?
I have my next book is coming out in October of 2022, so it's a
Mhm.
ways off.
Yeah.
But I'm presently finishing up revisions and rewrites on it, so it's going to start hitting the production chain probably this summer. So whenever
Yeah.
that long process is, it will happen. Um, I am excited to be editing right now the October 2021 issue of
Yes.
Southwest Review, which
Yep.
is a wonderful magazine. That's just a great bit of fortune on my part to be in the right place at the right time. And I'm excited about what I'm getting and what I'm going to
Hmm.
share with people when that comes out. And I've also got a story coming out in that magazine in the summer issue. So one thing that I've been doing in the year of COVID is I've kind of rediscovered the love of writing short stories, which when I
Yeah.
was in the MFA program at the University of Mississippi kind of got ground out of me by just writing so many of them over and over again. And my whole dissertation or thesis was project was short stories. And I've in 20 years since, I don't, or 17, 16 years, I've not wanted to write a short story. So I'm just now getting back into that, which is, I'm a little rusty, but I'm enjoying it, and that's
Hmm.
important.
Yeah, I think that's exciting. I've always liked short stories, and I feel like you do something different in them than you do in a novel. So I fully support short stories. They're a lot of fun. And then, of course, the last question is, where can people find out more about you or follow you on social media?
Well, my website is theandydavidson.com. So it's just THE Andy Davidson. And my Twitter handle is the same thing. So I'm pretty easy to find if you Google me.
Nice.
Although don't mistake me for the Canadian Andrew Davidson, who wrote a gothic novel called Gargoyle and got paid $1 million advance for that book. That is not me.
It could have been you. So close.
Not quite.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was lovely chatting with you and hope to do it again soon. So enjoy the rest of your evening. Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.